Alright, everybody. This is still Sick Erin. We're going to start talking about Chapter 3, Biological Processes. And we're splitting this up into various parts. We're going to, on Thursday, these videos will take you up through a beginning of a discussion about the parts of a neuron. And then on Thursday, we will finish up talking about the nervous system, and we'll do the brain. What you will get from these videos is the entirety of the nature versus nurture discussion. Okay? And I think that's good. We won't fall too far behind, and we'll be able to devote all the time that we need to in class on Thursday to finishing up with this, and you'll hopefully still be very comfortable with your study guide and ready to go for the exam. This unit, biological processes, is one that a lot of people feel a little overwhelmed by because it starts to feel like it's all about these physical parts they have to memorize names to. And I just want to say, don't get too overwhelmed in your reading. I'm posting a brain cheat sheet on Blackboard that will give you, like, you don't get to use it during the test, but it'll give you a really quick, it's like a study cheat sheet where you'll get a really quick overview of, I can quickly glance at this, and these are the parts of the brain I'll need to know, and if it's not on this sheet, I don't need to know it. And it will give you some reminder notes of what each part does. So try not to get too overwhelmed by having to memorize all these physical structures. I help you with the cheat sheet and the study guide. Really target what's important. And remember, it is important to discuss underlying biology of psychological processes, because we are not brains floating in jars, or we are not just kind of consciousness floating in space. We inhabit a physical structure, and what we know is that the body informs thoughts and feelings and shapes them, and it goes the other direction as well. What we think, what we feel, what we do also changes our biological processes. So this is a really important kind of back and forth loop that happens, and it would be very neglectful to not try to understand the entirety of the human mind and human behavior through the lens of the underlying biology. And that's why I think this is a really important unit. Even if you don't think of yourself as a bio person, my hope is you'll find something here that will still strike you as interesting. For this first part, we're going to, before we get into like brain structures and stuff like that, we're going to talk about this broader theme of nature versus nurture. What we're going to be covering are the basics of evolutionary psychology and the role of genes and environment in behavior. And I like taking on this kind of broader topic first. And this is a good place, I think, to get a little bit more in-depth into evopsychology, because it's picked up a lot of steam in recent years, and there's been a lot of great research coming from people who are operating within this framework. It's been a very active area within the field, so it's good to devote a little extra time to talking about it. And what we're going to be looking at is what's the idea behind the evopsychological approach. This whole approach rests in the assumption that there is this unit of heredity. There's this physical structure. There's genes that can be passed down from parent to offspring, such that certain impulses or traits or behaviors, behavioral instincts, could be inherited. Okay, if we weren't thinking about human beings in terms of the their biology and the physical structures that they inhabit, none of evopsychology would make sense. And in fact, people who first started working on the ideas of evolution didn't know the specifics of what those structures were. They just assumed that they were there. And all of the discoveries later about genes and what DNA actually looked like, that kind of came later. But evopsychology rests in the whole premise of it rests in assumptions that there are these physical structures that we can pass things down in, and that's why we're talking about it in this biology unit. So we're going to begin with this just broader discussion about evopsychology and the whole debate about how genes versus environment just generally contribute to behavior. Because a lot of times people who spend all of their time doing research through the lens of evopsych are really focused on how do we explain human behavior by looking at what behavioral impulses nature would have selected for, would have best aided in survival, and then were those instincts then passed down because the people who had them best survived. And sometimes that can neglect, of course, the influence just of the current environment that you're in. Human behavior isn't all determined by passed down instincts that evolved. So there's been healthy debate, the nature versus nurture debate, about which matters more, right? Inherited instincts passed down through genes, excuse me, versus the influence of your immediate environment. So we're going to kind of get into that whole nature versus nurture debate a little bit too. But let's start by talking about the basics of evopsychology. First and foremost, evolutionary theory serves some important explanatory functions. It allows for the development of new predictions. A lot of predictions have been generated and tested within the field that no one would have ever come up with if they weren't thinking, well, what behavioral impulse might we expect to be there because people who had it would have passed on their genes more often. And so it would have been passed down. And if you remember talking about that study where we found out that males on average preferred the scent of the t-shirts worn by women when they were ovulating, that prediction would have never been generated if you weren't thinking about human behavior or human preferences through this evolutionary framework, because that's not really part of our immediate conscious experience that people have noted. Oh yeah, I really like the way women smell when they're ovulating. At least most people would say that's not something that people are immediately consciously observing. And so it probably isn't a prediction that would have ever been generated if we didn't have this framework. But of course, what evopsychologists thought was, wouldn't it make sense that men who happened to prefer the scent of women at that time would have pursued sex most often during that time and would have passed on their genes most often because she was ovulating. And so that allowed for that prediction. The experiment was designed, and there was some evidence to support the hypothesis. That's one reason why people who work within this framework like it, because they find they come up with novel predictions they might not have generated otherwise that are fun to test. And it also just provides a general, overarching, broad framework for human behavior. Some basic ideas of evolution. We've got variation, natural selection, heritability, and sexual selection. And if you want to get the gist of how evolution works, this is kind of your crash course. Make sure you're familiar with these terms. Let's help you by walking through them here. Variation is something that occurs naturally within any population of organisms. Without this fact, the whole idea of evolutionary theory would not make any sense. If every cheetah was identical, some traits could not be selected for and thus increase in frequency. However, they're not all identical. There are some faster ones, there are some slower ones. This opens up things to the possibility that some might be more useful for survival. Okay? So that's the first premise, that there just is variation within a population of organisms. Because you could imagine a hypothetical world where there was not. Natural selection, then, refers to the idea that some variations are going to be more helpful for survival in certain environments. It's the notion of survival for some. A cheetah that's faster is probably going to get food more reliably and is going to live longer than one that is slower. What is going to be selected for in this process of selection? Things that assist in food attainment, predator danger avoidance, and things that help with reproduction. Basically, you got to be able to get food to live long enough to pass on your genes. You got to be able to avoid becoming food, or just avoid other dangers that threaten survival to live long enough to pass on your genes. And then, even if you've got longevity, you have to successfully mate with somebody and pass on your genes. And so things that aid in successful reproduction, things that aid in obtaining food, and things that aid in avoiding danger. Those are the things that you would expect to see passed down more often within a species, and then increase in frequency. This is my Great Moments in Evolution cartoon. The joke here, of course, is that these frogs are thinking, I really wish we could get out there on land and get that ball. And there's like a moment where they leap out there, which obviously it happens much more slowly than that. And that's a mistake people often make in not realizing that. Okay, then we got the notion of heritability. The fact that some variations are more useful for survival wouldn't really matter so much. It would just end with that generation. Fast cheetahs would do better, live longer, hooray. But we'd still have a new generation of cheetahs moving fast and slow at the exact same frequencies if they couldn't be passed down. Right? And so that's the idea of heritability. There's actually some physical structure where that trait, that strength of speed, can be passed down to offspring, which will then also be more likely to survive and reproduce. The EEA, the era of evolutionary adaptiveness, refers to the fact that modern humans were thought to first emerge 130,000 years ago. Many aspects of today's environment were not present for most of human evolution, and so some behaviors toward which we are predisposed may no longer be adaptive in the current environment. If you hear somebody say, well, what would have the environment been like in the EEA? What they're saying is, what behaviors would have best aided in survival then? And that might mean that we'd predict that we would see those today. That doesn't mean we're saying they would most help people survive today in the era of iPhones and ordering things on Amazon Prime. Evolution works slowly and gradually. So one common misconception of evolutionary theory is that you're saying all you have to do is sit there and reflect on what would most help people survive right now, and that would have been selected for. Well, not necessarily the case. In fact, there could be this odd mismatch where you have instincts whose root cause or source can be explained as thousands of years of human evolutionary history that may no longer be necessarily adaptive in the current environment, particularly if there's been rapid changes. So cautions about the evolutionary model. Just because it worked for our ancestors, we're not saying that means it works for us today. The evolutionary model is not trying to give you a script for what you should do if you want to most survive or succeed in today's world. Rather, it's just trying to explain where an impulse might have come from. So if our ancestors, if we crave really calorie-dense food, that might be because in an era where food was a scarce resource and people were hunting and gathering, people who had the impulse to really store up on eating large amounts of this when they found it might have done better, because that would have prepared them for periods of famine where they didn't have a successful kill. That's very different than a food environment where you can drive up to a McDonald's window and reliably get a burger thrown at you every time, and storing up might not necessarily help you so much, but we're just trying to explain where maybe an impulse could have come from. So the other thing to remember is that a lot of the mating literature that looks at what kind of mating behaviors people engage in, because they might have best resulted in passing on genes, doesn't mean that applies to everybody today, because a lot of people today are on birth control that might prevent females from ovulating, for example, that might change cycles. So just remember that everything that we're talking about doesn't necessarily apply to the entirety of today's current modern day environment. And in addition, wouldn't necessarily produce the same if somebody was on birth control. So humans crave sweet and fatty foods. Precious commodities in the EA today may be too easily available. Right? And there's also trade-offs. Human evolution doesn't mean physical traits evolve to perfection. That's not the assertion. Many traits that help organisms attract a mate also make it harder to survive long enough to find a mate, and that's important to remember. Great example of this, the peacock. So this is a gorgeous display, and of course when the peahen sees it, she goes nuts, right? This huge display of very complicated plumage is a cue probably to the symmetry of it, is probably a cue to the overall genetic quality of the male, and all of these other things. And females, of course, go after the peacocks that have particularly cool plumage, and this particular trait helps in mate attainment. However, it takes a lot of biological energy to support, and in addition, it probably makes evading a predator no easier, okay? And so the very thing that can help attract a mate, which can result in the passing on of genes, can maybe make it harder to survive long enough to do so. That's what we call, and people talk about the peacock's plumage as a classic trade-off example. So if you think about all these principles and the cautions of the model, overall, what is the point of evopsychology? Well, it's the study of the evolution of behavior. I use the example of a physical trait on an animal, and in a bio class in the past, you probably heard evolution talked about in terms of the evolution of physical traits. But evolutionary psychology is a study of the evolution of behavior, using those same principles of natural selection, assuming that behavioral instincts, personality traits, can be similarly passed down in those genes. And those that would have best aided in survival and reproduction would have been the ones that would be passed down. So how can we understand what humans do, think, and feel through the lens of thousands of years of evolutionary history? And again, don't make the mistake of thinking that that means we're saying this is what people ought to do. You might have your own moral code or value system that determines what you ought to do. That's called the naturalistic fallacy. All evo psychologists are trying to do is just explain where an impulse might come from, good or bad, right? Might it have happened to result in passing genes more often? And we're not saying that every impulse people have best helps in survival today, and we're also not saying that the environment doesn't also factor in. So don't get confused about any of those points as you think about this model. But that's kind of your crash course in what evo psychology is. Here's an exercise for you to think about on your own. All right. Write this down, how you think an evo psychologist might predict people to answer these following questions. A boat starts to sink, contains a 40-year-old and 20-year-old child, both of the same sex, neither can swim. Who do you save? We're not saying that every person will do the same thing, but if you asked 5,000 people, would one be circled more on average, right? Because all other factors are not equal in every individual case, but all else being equal, right? Are you going to see one saved at a higher rate? So which one do you think? Think like an evolutionary psychologist. What would they predict? So think about that question, and I'll try to come back to that in class on Thursday, and we'll talk about it when I'm there. And then think about this one. Would you rather marry or have you married someone older or younger than yourself? Circle one here, older or younger. All right, so just jot down or keep in your brain your answers to those questions. We will revisit them on Thursday. Boy, when we meet in person. All right, and that'll also be a good quick in-person review to make sure you understood some of these evolutionary principles. Okay, I'm going to direct you over to the other video now.